Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. But before I start, Ms. Meadows mentioned the shoes along the Danube. What had happened in the closing days of World War II as the Russians were surrounding Budapest and they cut off the rail lines, they still wanted to kill more Jewish people. They took something like 5,000 Jewish people, had them undress, put 10 and 20 together, roped together with wire, and pushed them into the Danube and let them drown together, just as a last-ditch effort to kill people. It was the Arrow Cross that did most of it, and interestingly enough, the Arrow Cross has been re-erected in Budapest, and it is now an organization there with a terrible history. Thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you personally, Justice Smith and Mr. Chairman, for your support of every religion, race, gender, and age who live in this great country. The particular topic today, at this particular moment in history, after Paris and Copenhagen, responding to the rising tide of anti-Semitism, is sadly all too timely. It is reminiscent of an even darker age that we thought was behind us. With your permission, I'd like to submit a statement. Exactly 70 years ago, as American GIs advanced into Nazi Germany in the last days of the most devastating war in history, the world had a glimpse of the horror of unbridled anti-Semitism. The images of the concentration camp that were liberated throughout Europe in the spring of 1945 still cause a universal shudder to this day. For the first few decades after World War II, we mistakenly, all of us, believed that anti-Semitism, the age-old hatred of Jews, had finally disappeared from Europe and everywhere else. That's because in the 1950s and 60s, no one in their right mind wanted to be associated with Nazis. It is because we all saw where this kind of hatred leads. And perhaps people still harbored these beliefs, were too embarrassed to express them openly. I now tell you with the greatest sadness that after 70 years later, the age-old virus of anti-Semitism has returned in all its evil and ugliness. Anti-Semitism returned to the streets of Paris and Toulouse, to the streets of Brussels and Copenhagen. It has even returned to Berlin. You will hear the personal accounts of my friend Roger Kuckerman, head of the Jewish community of Paris, but listen to these frightening facts. Jews make up less than 1% of the population of France, but they were victims of more than half of all racial attacks in that country last year. The number of anti-Jewish attacks in France in 2014 doubled from the year before. In Great Britain, the number of anti-Semitic attacks also doubled from the year before. In Austria, again, we saw the amount of anti-Semitic attacks doubling. In fact, the EU report from 9 nations showed that 16 months ago, long before the latest wave of terror, Jews in these countries were already concerned about the growing anti-Semitism. You don't have to be a mathematician to see an obvious trend here. There is hatred growing throughout Europe that are causing Jews to wonder if they should leave. They're asking if there is a future for Jews on that continent. Last fall, I sat with representatives of the Jewish community in Rome, and they told me that although they may stay, their children and definitely their grandchildren will leave. They told me that the Jewish community in Rome that has existed since the time of Christ and survived Hitler would disappear within 25 years. How could this happen in 2015? The answer is that the strange confluence of hatred has taken hold across Europe today that comes from many different corners. There are huge populations of Muslim immigrants throughout Europe. Most are peaceful, but far too many of them have adopted radical Islam. There are thousands of young European Muslims that have left to fight with Islamic radicals in Iraq and Syria. And there is a real fear that they could return, bringing the bloodshed with them. Some have already returned, and we see the consequences. At the same time, we have seen the rise of smaller right-wing neo-Nazi extremist groups that become political forces in Hungary and Greece, and have seen on the streets in Germany and France. And there is a third force that may appear more benign, but it adds fuel to the fire. I'm talking about an educated elite class from universities to the media that have a pathological hatred of Israel. They would never consider themselves anti-Semitic, but they're quite open in their opinion that only Israel is the source of all the problems in the Middle East. This is intellectually dishonest and devoid of reality, but too many people have accepted their lies as the truth. And then there is technology. 70 years ago, Joseph Goebbels used newspapers, films, and marches to infuse hatred of Jews into mainstream society. Today, the power of the internet sends out a constant stream of anti-Semitic ideas at hyperspeed. And there are not enough people speaking out to counter these lies. Do you want to know what it's like to be openly Jewish in Europe today? Just go to YouTube and watch what happens when a young man simply walks down a European street wearing a yarmulke. He is insulted, shoved, spat on, and as we saw in France, Jews who are openly Jewish can also be killed. Once again, like the 1930s, many European Jews live in fear. Members of this committee, in my travels to all the communities, I've always asked the same question around Europe and the world. I've been asked, where is the United States? Why isn't the United States leading the world in that crisis? Right after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher grocery store in Paris, over 1 million people marched in defiance of those murders. Many of the leaders of Europe and the world linked arms in solidarity in the very front row, but there was not one U.S. representative with them in the front row. I believe this sent a very negative message around the world. European leaders have stepped up and strongly condemned these attacks on Jews and the rise of anti-Semitism. The United States must do the same. The United States must lead. When a neo-Nazi party like Jobbik in Hungary or Golden Dawn in Greece wins substantial votes in elections, the United States must condemn, in the strongest possible terms, these anti-Semitic parties. My fear is that muted condemnations, or worse, silence, could lead what we saw in Europe 70 years ago. And that led to the death of 60 million people and destruction of a continent. We must insist that European nations better share intelligence on anti-Semitic Islamic hate preachers. All countries must better monitor radical Islam recruiting in prisons and on the internet and in mosques. And without question, we must closely monitor European and US nationals returning from the Middle East and America and Africa. The United States can and must speak loudly and clearly to condemn this evil for what it is, the radical Islamic hatred of Jews. Mr. Chairman, one of the bravest men in history, Sir Winston Churchill, came to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. And he warned us that the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe was complete and an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Churchill was trying to wake up a sleeping world because too many people didn't want to believe him. We had just fought a war against totalitarianism, and we were tired. We didn't want to fight another one. Well, today, it's not an iron curtain that is descending across Eastern Europe. It is a white-hot fire, and its reach is much greater. This new incandescent flame is scorching the entire Middle East, from Tehran, across Iraq, and through Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and now Yemen. It stretches across parts of North Africa, and it destroys everything in its path and leaves nothing alive, not Jews, not Christians, and not Muslims. Who don't share their exact beliefs. Unless we act now, the flame of radical Islam could stretch across all of Europe as well. After Churchill's speech in Missouri, it took 44 years and billions of dollars to defeat Soviet communism. We were focused back then. We were committed. We were united with our allies, and we were able to win the Cold War without horrific bloodshed. But in order to defeat this new flame of radical Islam terror and survive, the United States must lead. I fear that if we don't stand up to this new foe immediately, it will take us much longer than 44 years to defeat it. I feel it will cost us much more of our treasure, and most tragically of all, I feel it will consume many, many more lives, not just in the Middle East and Europe, but here as well. Members of the committee, we must not let this happen again. Thank you.